Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome back for another virtual concert. Tonight's performance is called A Night in the Rosebud Saloon. It's just basically going to be a night of classic ragtime, and I came up with a new title for it because the Rosebud Saloon in St. Louis is where many of the great classic ragtimers played in the early 1900s. It was owned and operated by Tom Turpin, who's one of the most interesting characters in the history of ragtime music, and I'll tell you a little bit more about him as we get going. But first up is his first published composition, and it was the first instrumental rag ever published by an African-American composer from 1897. It's called The Harlem Rag by Tom Turpin. Thank you so much. There's the Harlem Rag. It was significant because it was the first published rag by an African-American composer. There is also a legend that that piece predates 1897 by several years, which makes it one of the earliest compositions ever written in the ragtime style. Now, of course, the most famous name who played at the Rosebud Cafe. And incidentally, before I go any further, I call it the Rosebud Saloon, which it was. There was a bar in the front, and there was a secret room in the back, a wine cellar where all of the piano players played. I was just reading about that again today in the book, They All Played Ragtime. And I'm not sure exactly what went on upstairs, but for all intents and purposes, it was a saloon, and it had a bar. And that's where all the ragtimers played. And of course, Scott Joplin was the most famous name who played there. And so I've got to play some of Joplin's music for you tonight, and I thought it would be appropriate to play the Swipesy Cakewalk because Arthur Marshall also played at the Rosebud Saloon in St. Louis after they all left Sedalia. And this is the first piece published by Arthur Marshall, and the first one that Joplin wrote right after the Maple Leaf Rag from 1900, the Swipesy Cakewalk. so much. Swipesy Cakewalk. Carl, I don't think that's quite right. If you go back and read the book again, there was a hunting and shooting club that a lot of the piano players at the Rosebud were a part of, but I think that was a separate room or in a separate building. I was just reading it this afternoon. Of course, it was so long ago, nobody today really remembers, but for several years, the Rosebud Saloon was the #1 place in St. Louis where all of the piano players would go to play. Tom Turpin, of course, was called the father of St. Louis ragtime, and I'll tell you more about him in a bit. But as part of this concert, of course, I have to play the piece that Scott Joplin wrote in honor of the Rosebud Saloon. And just like in the early days, those musicians did not just play ragtime, and nor do I. This piece is not a rag, but a march, meaning it's not syncopated at all. It's a traditional march from 1905. The Rosebud closed, I think, in 1906. It really wasn't around that many years. If you're curious to see what it looked like, they have recreated the building next door to the Scott Joplin House State Historic Site in St. Louis. So you can go see kind of what it looked like. I don't know if they found the original blueprints or what it was, but anyhow, here's this cute little ditty written by Scott Joplin in 1905, published by John Stark, respectfully dedicated to my friend Tom Turpin, the Rosebud March. Never played this before. Thank you very much. The Rosebud March. Oh dear. Well, everybody, I don't know what's going on now exactly. I'm sorry we've been having these glitches the last few weeks. We did have a big rainstorm here this afternoon. And I guess this would be the appropriate time to tell you that I had a man knock on my front door about 2 days ago. And I thought, who in the world is this? And he said that he was coming to warn me that they are doing construction in my neighborhood, putting in new fiber optic cables for the internet. And I said, oh boy, does that mean there's going to be better internet service in this area? He said, well, we are a new company that are competing with Spectrum, so I may be able to sign up for a new internet company. And he told me more about it. He says, well, it's going to be a much higher upload speed, and it's going to be a cheaper monthly payment. And so I actually already signed up for it. So I may have new internet service here sometime this fall, and hopefully these issues will not be happening too much anymore. Don't forget to hit the refresh button if you're having trouble with the streaming. Someone says I've lost sync. Hopefully that doesn't happen. Hit the refresh button on your internet browser, everybody. I'm going to keep going, like usual. Although at this point in the concert, I do usually mention that I accept virtual tips for these performances. All you have to do is send in a tip on PayPal or Venmo, and the information is in the chat and the postings on all three websites. Every little bit helps me with my career and helps me make a living doing this music, which I have always wanted to do, but haven't been able to do terribly successfully until I started virtual concerts. Yeah, good. Boy, got a lot of the young ragtimers listening tonight. Leo Roth and Zeke Backus. Gosh, it's great to have you guys with us. I'm happy to take requests as usual, although I will probably stick mostly to classic ragtime tonight. Please feel free to send in requests anytime you want. Next up, I want to play some more pieces by Tom Turpin, however. And as I mentioned, Turpin is known as the father of St. Louis ragtime. He was a huge man, something like 6'8", weighing over 300 pounds. And Charlie Thompson said that he was so tall he had to put his piano up on bricks to play it. That's a little bit about Turpin. And next one I want to play is a piece that came out in 1900. It's kind of short, but it's a very interesting rag called A Ragtime Nightmare. A little bit of the melody of this is supposed to be based on an earlier tune called The Darky's Dream. And Turpin changed it around and called it A Ragtime Nightmare. There's a quick version of Ragtime Nightmare. Now up next, another tune from 1899. And it's curious this is named after New York. You would think that Turpin must have taken a trip to New York City, and that's why he wrote the Harlem Rag. And then 2 years later, in 1899, he wrote this piece, which is called Bowery Buck. And Charlie Thompson said that the trio of this piece, many years later, he told historians, it was probably Trey Tishner who wrote it in a book, that the third theme of this piece was a popular Chestnut Valley street organ melody. So you never know where the original floating folk strains came from. But it came out in 1899 and it's called Bowery Buck by Tom Turpin. Bowery Buck. Thank you very much, folks. Why is this one shorter than other rags? I don't know. I'd have to go back in Ragtime Nightmare and count the number of measures. Maybe there's just a little bit less music than usual. Well, looks like everything's working here, so that's good. Send in some requests, folks. Don't be shy. Happy to play whatever you want to hear. My cousins Rick and Joe Carroll from Texas are listening as usual. Appreciate it very much. Penny Schwartz from Baltimore, nice to have you with us. Oh, that's a good idea. Isabel says on YouTube, Adam, I really like Chestnut Street in the 90s. And don't worry, I'm going to play St. Louis Rag too. But let's do the Brun Campbell piece next. Campbell was one of the pianists who went to Sedalia, met Scott Joplin, and later played, I'm quite sure, at the Rosebud Saloon in St. Louis. It's a little difficult to know for sure which of these composers actually played at the Rosebud. One of the reasons I checked the book, They All Played Ragtime this afternoon, is I wasn't entirely sure who played there and who didn't. But Campbell knew Turpin very well, so I'm sure he played there. And this is probably his best piece, which was recorded many years later in the 1940s, I think 1946, and is called Chestnut Street in the 90s, imitating the sounds of Chestnut Street in St. Louis back in the 1890s. Supposedly this is what it sounded like, and the two streets that go right through St. Louis are Chestnut Street and Market Street. I think the Rosebud was on Market Street. Somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but anyhow, here's Chestnut Street in the 90s. much Chestnut Street in the 90s. I want to play a piece for you by Joe Jordan next. Now, Joe Jordan was born in Cincinnati, but he was one of the legendary ragtimers that played at the Rosebud, and he's primarily known for two songs that he wrote in later years after he'd moved to Chicago, that Teasin' Rag and Lovey Joe, the song that made Fanny Brice famous. But I'm going to do one of his early instrumental rags from 1903, during the time that he still lived in St. Louis. And this is probably one of the best of his instrumental rags. I played it for the first time, 2 or 3 months ago, and I thought, it's time to do it again. Here is Nappy Lee, a slow drag by Joe Jordan, 1903. The rags that say a slow drag, it doesn't mean play them like a funeral dirge. It just means a little bit slower than a really fast dance tune, or a little bit slower than, say, a circus gallop. That was music that was very popular at that time. That is my interpretation of it. And so here's Jordan's Nappy Lee. Thank you very much, folks. Please play more Harlem Ragtime. You mean Harlem Rag by Turpin? Already played that one. Hope you liked Nappy Lee as much as I do. One of the reasons I wanted to play that for you is because I think there's a lot of similarity between the early Tom Turpin rags and the instrumental rags that Joe Jordan wrote. In fact, Johnny Maddox told me that Joe Jordan told him that he's the one that did the arrangement of Turpin's St. Louis rag for publication. And so I'm going to play that next for you from the same year, 1903, written in honor of the St. Louis World's Fair. And The fair was delayed a year. It didn't actually open until 1904, but this came out in '03, and this is probably the very best of the Turpin rags, one of the most important rags of the period, really. It was recorded by Wes Osman, the banjo player, and many others. Here is Turpin's St. Louis Rag, and see if you think it's similar to Joe Jordan's music. Thank you very much, St. Louis Rag. I'm just trying to read the comments here. My goodness, have someone listening from Argentina tonight. Do I know any song play tango? I know a few tangos, but I'm not sure of that particular style. Might play you one later if you stick around. Let me check Facebook here real quick. Oh my gosh, that's an obscure one. Happy Feeling Rag from Omaha. No, that's too obscure for me. Just because I'm a ragtime pianist does not mean I know every obscure rag ever written. I told someone else that in an interview recently. I said, just because I'm supposed to be a great ragtime player doesn't mean I know all the obscure ones. Yes, that was 1903. The Chrysanthemum, I'm afraid I don't know that. This Tom on YouTube has requested St. Louis Tickle. Why don't I play that for you next? It's very appropriate because it was one of the other most popular instrumental rags written in honor of the St. Louis World's Fair. It was actually written by Theron C. Bennett, but he used a pseudonym on the cover of the music. And it includes the same theme that is part of Buddy Bolden's Blues, another floating folk strain that came out of New Orleans. But here it is, the St. Louis Tickle. Thank you very much. That St. Louis Tickle. That is pretty close to the way Johnny Maddox played it on his first record. I've always loved that. I had the idea, it was actually Zeke Backus who gave me the idea to do this tonight, that I should play all three pieces written by the legendary Louis Chavon. And Louis Chavon was supposed to be the greatest pianist in St. Louis in the early 1900s who could outplay all of them, Turpin and Scott Joplin. And sadly, he died very young. You know, there was no cure for syphilis in those days. He died in 1908. I think he was about 24 years old. But they said that he played everything brilliantly. He would take say a Sousa march or a Joplin rag, put it in the key of B natural with octaves and contrary motion in every direction. And that's how good he was. And of course, he played at the Rosebud Saloon, and he played in a group of musicians with Tom Turpin, Scott Joplin, Joe Jordan, and Sam Patterson. Sorry, Joplin was not in the group. There were four of them. And it's just a shame they never made any recordings, because it must have been really something to hear all of them on four pianos. He toured with Sam Patterson, who was another black ragtime pianist and a vaudeville performer of the day. And Chavon died and left three surviving compositions. This one came out in Des Moines, Iowa in 1903. This was the first one, and it was written by Chavon and Sam Patterson. Looky there, right at the top of the music, respectfully dedicated to Tom Turpin. So I'd like to play for you this piece called "The Moon is Shining in the Skies." And then I'll do the other Chavon song, and then of course the Heliotrope Bouquet, which is better known. But here's this rare tune by Louis Chavon, one of the great St. Louis ragtimers, called "The Moon is Shining in the Skies." You can hear a little bit of his, unusual harmonic voice in this. Thank you very much. Music by Chavon and Patterson. I think that's a French name, but supposedly he was of African American and Spanish Indian ancestry. And now the next tune, which comes from 1906, I believe. This has words by Elmer Bowman, who's another important African American songwriter. the early 1900s, and music by Louis Sivan. 1906, it's called Babe, It's Too Long Off. Thank you very much. Babe, It's Too Long Off. Walper House Rag. No, afraid I don't know that either. That's one of those obscure tunes that I don't know. And sure, I play obscure pieces like this once in a while, but I have to get out the sheet music and practice them. That's why I can't do A Little Black Baby by Scott Joplin either. It's A Little Black Babe is the title of it. In those pieces I just played, you could hear, a little bit of the voice that comes in the next piece, which came out in 1907, the year before Sivan died. And thank goodness that Scott Joplin put this one down on paper. He wrote Sivan wrote the first two sections, Joplin wrote the second two sections. It's pretty obvious based on the musical style. From 1907, here is the beautiful Heliotrope Bouquet. you very much. Yes, Judy, you're right. 129 watching and only 70 likes. Please hit the like button, everybody. It might help me make another tip. You never know. It might help me reach some new people with this music. I think I'm a little bit too historical or academic to ever go viral. But I noticed that my YouTube channel is now up to 8,000 subscribers, which really sounds pretty good. I'd love to see that become a few tens of thousands. And then anytime I go live, there will be thousands of people who instantly see my live streams. Now I'm going to play for you a couple of player piano rolls. And let me make some space on the piano here. I don't remember whether I have ever played the hand-played Scott Joplin rolls for you on a virtual concert before. Whether I have or not, I'm going to play some for you now. We're going to let Scott Joplin himself play this piano. Joplin made about 7 hand-played rolls, and of course there is a lot of controversy whether he actually played them. Some people believe the rolls could be William Arlington, who also recorded Classic Rags on the Connorized piano roll label, and his playing really does sound just like these rolls. However, I don't know. When Trevor Tishner met Arthur Marshall, he played some of these rolls for him and pointed out the octave runs that are thrown in the left hand, and Arthur Marshall said, "You've got the right rolls, all right." So I'm kind of a believer in the Joplin rolls myself, and I thought I would play the piano roll for you of Something Doing, which is one of Joplin's collaborations with Scott Hayden, who played at the Maple Leaf Club and the Rosebud Saloon in St. Louis. I had to represent Scott Hayden. And so here is Something Doing, supposedly played by Scott Joplin himself a few years later in 1916. fans, let me tell you, I'm going to play you one more piano roll just for the fun of it. And this is kind of special because I just got this in the mail on Friday. Let me get this one rewound. That's a recut and it's a double roll. I just recently obtained, I suppose it's okay to tell you, it was on eBay. I obtained an original copy of a piano roll that's very special. It's only the second one of these I've ever seen. I'm going to show you, maybe even bring the label up close. Here is the Ole Miss Rag, hand-played by Scott Joplin himself, and this is an original copy of the roll from 1916. I don't know if that did any good. But I'm going to play you the original roll just one time for this virtual concert, and then put it away carefully and probably never touch it again. This is interesting because it's the only one of the Joplin rolls that he made of a composition written by someone else. Now we don't, well, oh, it looks a little blurry there on the screen, oh well. Joplin supposedly rarely played pieces ever written by anyone else. And we don't have any evidence that Joplin and W.C. Handy knew each other, but, you know, all those guys did. They both lived in New York at the same time. They probably did. Regardless, the Ole Miss Rag is interesting. It's really the only instrumental rag written by the father of the blues, W.C. Handy. And here it is, king of ragtime himself, on the original roll, Ole Miss Rag, from 1916. I have to watch the tracking on this because it's very old. Ole Miss Rag. Handy later changed the name of that to the Ole Miss Blues without changing one note of the music. What's interesting about having the original copy of this roll is that there is dynamic markings on it. There's a line that goes low and high, And so you can control the dynamics a bit on a player piano like this, either with your feet or this dynamic lever, which is fairly unique to the Apollo player pianos. Let me put that away carefully, and that goes on the shelf. Someone says, "Where's Dylan tonight?" He's probably asleep in England. Well, don't forget to share these live streams. Hit the like button, everybody. Help me out. We've got 142 watching now on YouTube. That's pretty good. I'm sure that means we're over 150 total. And I do accept virtual tips for these concerts. If you enjoy the music and want to help me make a career out of it, every little bit helps. There's both PayPal and Venmo information in the chat and the postings on all three websites. And if you don't trust PayPal, there's a P.O. box on my website for checks as well. And like I say, every little bit helps my career and kind of supports what you might call the ragtime habit. I have often said that I don't play just ragtime. And you will hear a little bit of early jazz and blues in the second half of tonight's concert, but I don't know, there is something about classic ragtime that holds a special place in my heart. I don't think I'll ever stray away from it too far. But tonight's concert is called A Night at the Rosebud Saloon, and as such I'm doing a lot of classic ragtime from St. Louis. That's where the Rosebud was, and I have done a St. Louis themed ragtime concert before, so tonight's performance is not going to be all that different, really. Speaking of some early jazz tunes, I think I'll play these for you next. And don't forget to send in requests. If you want to hear some requests tonight, I'll certainly have time to do it. And but I'm going to play these two next. I have two copies of this tune sitting on the piano. And these are very appropriate for tonight's concert because they're both written by a black pianist who was from Tennessee who moved to St. Louis in the 1890s. His name was Charles Warfield. Now, maybe you don't know that name, but if you, again, look at the book, They All Played Ragtime. There's two photographs of him. He's also in the picture of the Hurrah Sporting Club, or whatever it was called, that all the Rosebud piano players were part of. And Charlie Warfield wrote a song that became an enormous jazz standard over the years, but he was originally one of the St. Louis ragtime pianists. And this tune came out in 1916, and I believe this is the original copy of it. Johnny Maddox gave me this. You can tell because he put that stinking tape all over it. He used to tape up his sheet music, and I told him not to do that to the original copies. But this is the original edition. You notice the title of the tune is I Ain't Got Nobody Much. However, Charlie Warfield's name is not on it. It says it was written by Spencer Williams. Now here's another copy, which says the normal title, I Ain't Got Nobody. The word much has been removed, and Charlie Warfield's name has been included as composer. So, like many other artists of the period, he had to allow other musicians to put their name on it in order just to get the music published. But there's no doubt that he's the composer. And you see Bert Williams is on the cover of this one, this copy. He must have sung it. And I'm going to play it for you now. I added the verse onto the tune. It's not quite the way it's written in the music. In fact, both copies of this sheet music to this tune are completely different. You know, the harmonies and so forth are quite different. My version of the tune is inspired by Naki Parker. Now that I've said all that, here is I Ain't Got Nobody, and Nobody Cares for Me. got nobody, and nobody cares for me. Thank you, folks. Well, now here's the other tune by Charlie Warfield, one of the great St. Louis ragtimers. It came out in 1919. Now, like I said, we're getting into the early jazz era here, but these are his, as far as I know, his only 2 published songs, and both of them were enormous traditional jazz hits. I believe this is the first edition published by Clarence Williams. Here we go, from 1919. Baby, Won't You Please Come Home. Lots of famous musicians have, you might say, covered this song, from blues singers to Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys. And I guess I've never really played it, but I sat down and sight read it this afternoon. It's a pretty simple tune, but I bet it's recognizable to you. Here's Baby, Won't You Please Come Home. Oh, Fats Waller recorded it on the organ too. Yep. Oh, I see a request for a Charlie Thompson piece. Yeah, I'll play that for you just here in a minute. Okay. Baby, won't you please come home? Baby, Won't You Please Come Home by Charlie Warfield, one of the forgotten St. Louis ragtimers who undoubtedly played at the Rosebud. In fact, he was one of the ones in the 1904 piano contest that Tom Turpin held. I think Charlie Warfield and Joe Jordan was in it, and of course, Louis Chavon was the winner. I got a request here. This is from Ryan with an I, on YouTube for a piece by Charlie Thompson, who was also one of the great St. Louis ragtimers. He probably played at the Rosebud, although he might have been a little bit too young. I'm not sure about that. I think his name is also in that newspaper article about the piano contest in 1904, but he would have been a little kid at the time. And Charlie Thompson, of course, was known for the Lily Rag. Why don't I play both of them for you? First, we'll do the Lily Rag from 1914, which was arranged by Artie Matthews, and I'm going to play some of his music for you in a minute as well. But first, the Lily Rag, and then I'll play that request from Ryan on YouTube. This is the one piece that Charlie Thompson had published. played very much the way he used to do it. Thank you very much, the Lily Rag. And now the other rag that I got the request for, called Delmar Rag. And it was long believed that this piece was named for Delmar Boulevard in St. Louis, but Trevor Tishner told me it was more probably named for Delmar Gardens, which was an early amusement park in St. Louis. And Charlie Thompson used both of these two tunes in 1916 to defeat Tom Turpin in a contest for the Missouri State champion ragtime pianist. I'm reading some comments here. Oh, Brian, yes, I almost forgot I was going to play those for you, but I'll be happy to do it. First up, the Delmar Rag. I'm going to try and get in some requests here. Delmar Rag. you very much. The Delmar Rag by Charlie Thompson. That one was never published, but I'm very glad. About 18 or 19 years ago, I asked Tom Breyer to transcribe all of the unpublished Charlie Thompson pieces, so I've been playing them ever since. Yeah, thrilled to get a request for that. I appreciate it. Hey, Adam, any plans to visit Bix Fest this year? I sure would love to go if they would ever have me. I have mentioned before on my virtual concerts that I can't seem to get anyone at the major traditional jazz festivals to hire me. I don't know why I've been pigeonholed as only a ragtime pianist. Yes, I play a lot of it and I love it, but I play equally as much 20s and 30s jazz as I do ragtime. Tonight's concert is called A Night at the Rosebud Saloon. So yes, tonight's performance is mostly classic ragtime. I'm not sure what I'll do for the next concert. It should be something different. I had another request I was going to play. What was it? Let me check real quick. Oh yes, I promised this to a young man named Brian. As I said, I don't just play ragtime, and these are what you might call pop songs of the ragtime era. They are ragtime in a sense, but they're pop songs, you know. Even Scott Joplin himself, I'm sure, did not just play instrumental rags. He played the fiddle, he sang in a barbershop quartet, he would have known all the pop songs of the day, and here's a couple of them. Just to change things up a little bit, I promised this to this fellow. There are two tunes that I recorded with Johnny Maddox when we did our 2-piano CD together, and I've been playing them ever since. We're going to do, these are both from the late teens, 1917 or 18. The first one's called At the Storybook Ball, and with it a hit from 1917 that was recorded by Van and Skink called Huckleberry Finn. If I were Huckleberry Finn, I'd do the things he did, I'd be a kid again. You'd find me out swimming beside a shady pool, wishing there never was a school. If I was only Huckleberry Finn, if I was only Huckleberry Finn, I'd do the things he did, I'd be a kid again. And then I wouldn't put my shoes and stockings on for any man. All I'd ever wear would be a coat of tan if I were only Huckleberry Finn. First one is At the Storybook Ball. very much. What CD is that medley available on? It's called Seven Little Stars. The album I recorded with Johnny was named after a Glenn Rowell tune. I don't know if that's still on streaming or not. I have absolutely no physical copies of the CD left, unfortunately. I also recorded Huckleberry Finn with Ian Whitcomb, and it's been so long since I've played both songs that I didn't want to play the verse without looking at the sheet music first. I have to start playing those more often. Well, there's a composer that I have not represented yet in tonight's concert who's very important in the St. Louis ragtime scene, and his name was Artie Matthews, and I pulled out a very rare original copy of one of his pieces to show you. Of course, he's the one who wrote the 5 pastime rags, which are among the most unusual pieces in the classic ragtime repertoire. He probably played at the Rosebud Cafe. At the very least, he played with Tom Turpin at the Booker T. Washington Theater, which was an all-black theater run in St. Louis by Charlie Turpin, Tom's brother. And here is the original copy of Pastime Rag number 3. I was so thrilled to finally obtain a copy of this. This might be my favorite of all of them, so I'm going to play this for you now. And the historian Ed Berlin discovered that the woman on the cover of the music is Eleanor Stark, John Stark's daughter, who was a famous classical pianist at the time. So clearly, the publisher and the composer considered this to be, well, I don't need the sheet music, what am I doing? They considered this to be high-class rag. Pastime Rag number 3. much. Pastime rag number 3. Yeah, we're getting into the late St. Louis style ragtime now. That does sound a lot like Cataract Rag. In fact, I think Artie Matthews might have been the arranger of Cataract Rag. I'm reading a comment here on YouTube. Well, now let me play you one of the other very interesting pieces by Artie Matthews. And this one is significant because it's one of the only blues pieces that John Stark published. He probably did that and asked Artie Matthews to write this tune because the term blues had become a fad. And in 1915, the Weary Blues was published. It is the first notated example of a boogie-woogie walking bass line. And the traditional jazz bands picked this one up too and to kind of change the way the tune sounded. This is pretty close to the way it was originally written. Here's Artie Matthews' Weary Blues. Thank you very much. Weary Blues. There's some music by Artie Matthews. Well, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's concert of St. Louis ragtime, just like a night at the Rosebud Saloon. And I suppose I might play one more piece to close the concert tonight. And I wouldn't be surprised if some of my regular listeners, Amy and Maryland, would like to hear some music by Joe Jordan. There's this piece they love called Corsica. And so I was kind of thinking about playing that teasin' rag to close the concert. Why don't I just make a medley out of both of them? Since Joe Jordan outlived a lot of the other guys, and he's probably one of the only one of the pianists who played at the Rosebud Saloon who ever made recordings later in his life. So let's do two of his tunes, supposedly written the same year, 1909. Here's That Teasin' Rag, which makes a great stomping finish. But I'm actually going to close the concert with Corsica, an unpublished tune he wrote that I learned from Johnny Maddox. And that'll make for a more sentimental ending to tonight's concert. So here's two tunes by Joe Jordan. Thank you very much. There's two tunes by Joe Jordan. Well, I hope you've enjoyed tonight's concert at night in the Rosebud Saloon. And perhaps a classic jazz-themed concert would be good for the next virtual performance. I'll probably do something along those lines. And in the meantime, thank you very much for the virtual tips. It's much appreciated. It helps me out a lot when I'm not working elsewhere. And there will be no virtual concert next Sunday, unfortunately, but I'll be having a great time at my family reunion in Texas. So I will see all of you 2 weeks from tonight. I'm skipping one Sunday, and I'll be back 2 weeks from tonight for yet another virtual concert on all three websites. Thank you so much for listening, folks, and good night for now.